Hi, I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of the Division of Social Sciences. On behalf of the Division, Women in Philanthropy, and the Center for Language, Interaction, and Culture, it is my pleasure to welcome you to a special lecture featuring New York Times bestselling author, Professor Deborah Tannen. Research is the foundation of the Division of Social Sciences, and we are proud of our Center for Language, Interaction, and Culture for its dedication to training students and scholars in interdisciplinary theories and methodologies for understanding multiple uses of language in everyday life. I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Tanya Stivers, the Center's Director and Professor of Sociology. Tanya's research attempts to uncover the underlying structures of conversation using recordings of spontaneous, naturally occurring social interaction. Studying how and when people use particular interaction practices and to what effect helps us understand where the boundaries are in terms of culture and language. Professor Tanya Stivers.
Thank you for joining us tonight, especially with the excitement of the last game of the World Series on the screens right outside. I know it's a nail-biter for many of us. My grandma among the people who are watching with anticipation. My name, as you heard, is Tanya Stivers. I'm the director of UCLA's Center for Language, Interaction, and Culture. This center brings together faculty and students from different disciplines, ranging from psychology, education, communication, linguistics, anthropology, and sociology, who have a central interest in how people interact with one another. If you've ever been someone who's wound up saying, it wasn't what he said, but how he said it, or I couldn't get in a word in edgewise, I don't know why, or I don't understand why my doctor doesn't listen to me, any of those things are the types of things that we worry about in our sorts of research. It's at the heart of what we think about, but we do this in a lot of different contexts. And this ranges from youth cultures to police interactions, 911 calls, to classrooms. We've got students who are studying culture and interaction in India, in Cameroon, in Chile, in Mexico, and Peru. We've got students working domestically on topics like how conversation affects whether we receive medication in a medical visit or what kind of medication, how doctors and patients communicate differently if the patient has a higher level of education or a lower level of education, and how this communication is different when the physician is an internist or a geriatrician or a pediatrician. We ask things like how are 911 calls made and how are suspects described in those calls, and we can start to think about how that affects police response. We look at children and how they communicate with each other, with their mothers, with their teachers, to better understand everything from the learning process to how they're socialized to become medical patients, to become friends, to become students, and to become fully fledged family members. Our center is at the forefront of this type of research worldwide because of the scope of our research across these areas. And you can imagine in this era of major tensions between police and citizens, cultural misunderstandings about religion, and prescription drug crises in terms of both antibiotic overprescribing and the overuse of opioids, the range of the work we do couldn't be more timely. We're very lucky to get to invite a number of people from around the country and sometimes around the world who are working on these topics to share their work with us a few evenings every year. Tonight's an extra special evening because we have the privilege of having Deborah Tannen with us. She is one of the pioneers of this way of working and has shown that talk and interaction is critical and should be studied in its own right. The major current through her work is understanding the role of gender in communication strategies, whether this is in romantic relationships, student-teacher contexts, family conversations, or same-sex friends. How do women talk differently? And what are the implications of that for our lives as wives, as mothers, as sisters, as colleagues, and as friends? Many of us academics would love to reach out to a more general audience, and then we relive Thanksgiving dinners, when Uncle Joe or Aunt Sue asked us what we were doing in graduate school. And no matter what we said, it seemed like it wasn't quite important enough. And that's how a lot of basic research starts. We start small and we build up. Deborah has figured out how to translate the detailed work of scholarship on discourse and conversational style into stories that we can all understand and relate to, with important implications for how we live our lives, communicating with our partners, our family members, and our friends. Her most famous book, You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, was on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 4 years. Later, in Talking from 9 to 5, Deborah examined how gender matters for the way men and women speak in the workplace and how their characters and work are seen and evaluated. Family conversation is taken on in several books where Deborah explores a mother-daughter relationship, sister relationships, and the family as a whole. Now, gendered friendships are being put under the microscope in her latest book, about which we'll be hearing tonight, You're the Only One I Can Tell, Inside the Language of Women's Friendships. I'm sure I speak for all of us in saying I'm very excited to hear Deborah talk about her latest book, so please join me in welcoming her to the floor.
Thank you so much. What a treat to be able to speak to all of you today and to be a guest of Click. It really is a unique and so important center of this kind of research. And I've always envied people who get to work here at Click. And so everybody at UCLA for having it. Maybe I'll come around here. I'm actually not going to be using that, so I might as well just stand here myself. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So the talk that I'm giving today is about the book that was published just recently, this past summer, about friendships among women. So I'm going to be saying things about women's friendships, but I will also be saying some things comparing friendships of women to friendships of men. And so I want to say right at the start, as I do about everything I ever write that mentions women and men, not all women and men are the same. In fact, I did not start out as an expert in gender. My first book, my dissertation, was about New York versus California conversational style. That might be another talk I might give. And I have written about Greek compared to American. And the first book that I wrote for general audiences actually was a book called That's Not What I Meant. And it's about all the influences on style. Gender was one, but also class, region, part of the country you come from, ethnic background, sexual orientation. So there are many, many influences other than gender, and I want to make it clear right at the start that I know that not all women and men are the same. So much of what I am saying about friendships among women may also apply to friendships among women and men, certainly women and gay men. My own best friend is a gay man. It's kind of interesting. I have some discussion of that in the book, and the editor wanted me to take it out. She said, this is about women's friendships. I said, those are really important women's friendships. So didn't want to, it's so important to me, I did not want to take that out. But there are patterns that tend to characterize friendships among girls and women. For this book, I interviewed 80 girls and women, ranging in age from 9 to 97. And the 97-year-old is still alive. She recently celebrated her 100th birthday. When in these interviews, and much of what I'll be saying today is based on those interviews, some from classes that I've taught at Georgetown. And so I want to emphasize right here, anytime I quote somebody that I interviewed or a student of mine, it's with permission. And I not only get permission beforehand, but once I've decided what I want to use, I show them exactly what I've written. And I ask, did I get it right? Is there anything you would want me to change for accuracy, for privacy? If you've changed your mind, you don't want me to use it, fine, just let me know it's out. That's very important, I think, for us that do research with people who are generous enough to give us their personal lives to talk about. Okay, so the kinds of comments that I heard in these interviews that I did, most of them were effusive about how important their friendships were. So I heard comments like, my friendships with women are as essential as air. My women friends are the most sustaining thing in my life. And most of the women I interviewed said things like that. But I did also hear comments like, I find friendships with women difficult terrain to navigate. And I wanted to understand the processes that led to comments like that as well. I heard overwhelmingly, deeply moving stories about what friends did for friends, especially in difficult times. Friends who hopped on a plane, flew across the country, stayed for a week or longer to help recover from surgery, recover from a loss. So many, many very moving stories like that. A friend who called, a friend who had suffered a loss, called her every day for a year. But I also heard about friends who spoke every day for no particular reason, just because they wanted to be in touch. And in a way, that was the most constant comment that I heard, that is, she's there when I need to talk. And this is one of the things that tends to distinguish friendships among women from friendships among men. Again, only a tendency. Women tend to talk more at greater length and about more personal topics. But that does also mean you have more opportunity to say the wrong thing. And if you say the wrong thing, it's going to go deeper because the topic was personal. A woman I was talking to who was telling me about a very, very painful situation that many of us have experienced, that is the passing of a very close friend of hers. And she commented, she said, the worst thing is that I can't call her up and tell her how terrible I feel about her dying. Because she's the one that she would have called in a situation like that. So all this talk makes women's friendships very gratifying, but also sometimes complicated. And as I said, kind of distinguishes friendships between women and those typify friendships between men. So I want to retell a conversation that somebody told me about that captures this somewhat. So this was told me by a woman whose son had recently graduated from college and had moved across the country. Actually, he's in California. She's in Washington, where I live. And so she was talking to him on the phone and asking him about one of his friends that she knows quite well. So the conversation went something like this. Have you talked to Mike lately? And he said, yeah, talked to him yesterday. Well, how is he? I don't know. But you just talked to him, didn't he say? Nope. Well, how's his job? I don't know. How's his girlfriend? Don't know. What did you talk about? Football. Did you only talk about football? No. Soccer, too. And that would be unusual for a close friendship among women. When I read that interchange in a group, something like this, and a man came up to me afterwards and he said that this really rang a bell. He and his wife, he said, were friends with another couple, and he socialized regularly with the husband, and wife socialized regularly with the wife. And one evening, his wife said to him, "Isn't it terrible that they're getting a divorce?" And he was shocked. They had been playing tennis every week for months. And he said the subject of his marriage never came up. That would be surprising and unexpected in a conversation in a friendship among women. Another kind of thing I'll read you that will capture what these contrasts sometimes are. I teach a class called Cross-Cultural Communication, and all the students every week have to write what I call field notes. So they observe something or take part in some conversation, some interaction, and then they, as a field note, write a detailed description of that experience, and then they comment on it in terms of various methods we've been discussing in class. So this is somebody's field note that captures this. The student wrote, "Saturday night after a party, a group of us went to Matt's house to hang out before we went home to bed. I and the other girls proceeded to sit down on the couch, and we began talking about the night, what we thought was fun, what we wished had happened, etc. I was in the middle of giving my friend Sarah advice about a boy when all of a sudden the coffee table was pushed out of the way, the guys began to wrestle, throwing each other to the couch, pushing each other off the chairs. It was funny for me to see my big guy friends wrestling as if they were 5-year-olds. But it also struck me that this is how we chose to relax. The girls began talking, and the boys got up and started fighting. And she then goes on to comment, this is something that many people have written about, including me, that agonism, that is ritual fighting, play fighting, is much more common as a form of fun among the boys than it is among the girls. Girls do fight, but they tend to fight when they mean it, less likely to fight as a form of fun. But I was amused. She said it was funny to see her guy friends acting like 5-year-olds. Well, she and her friends were acting like 5-year-olds too. They were acting like 5-year-old girls. And much of the research on kids, and Candy Goodwin, your own Candy Goodwin, has done a lot of this research to pioneer in that respect, that girls are more likely to sit and talk. Doesn't mean they don't run around, doesn't mean the boys don't sit and talk, but in terms of how much time they spend doing it. I was intrigued that she said she was giving her friend Sarah advice about a boy, and I want to say something about that. There's a certain kind of talk that is very common among women. It's been written about, again, by many people in the field. I think it was termed this by Gail Jefferson, troubles talk. Talking about problems and getting your friends' thoughts about it. A woman that I interviewed, now in her 80s, still remembered this experience from when she was young. She had a little child, preschool, and she was home with the child, and she had a neighbor who had a little child of a similar age, and she told me this story. She said one time her neighbor called her up, and she was really kind of upset. Her little boy had dropped a jar of mayonnaise on the kitchen floor, and so he had spread the mayonnaise all over the floor, and then he had added eggs to it because he was going to make a cake. And she commented that her neighbor just left the mess and came over, and we just drank coffee and commiserated. And I love that word, commiserated, because it is helpful. Why it is, I don't know, but it is helpful just to know that somebody else has gone through something similar. And just without cleaning up, you could say her friend came and helped her clean up the kitchen floor, that we would understand how helpful that is. But no, it's helpful just to sit and talk. There's another thing that comment that the student wrote about, I was giving my friend advice about a boy, that is kind of significant to me for the following reason. There's something that I wrote in the book, You Just Don't Understand, about women and men, that got a lot of attention at the time that book came out. And a lot of people felt that it rang true, and it was kind of talked about a lot. And that's a scenario where a woman might tell a man about a problem, and then he tells her how to fix the problem, and then she's frustrated, and what I said at the time and what is often said, she didn't want a solution, she just wanted to talk about it, and then he's frustrated because if she wanted to talk about it, she must have wanted a solution. If she doesn't want to do anything about it, why would you talk about it? So that was how I described it at the time, and it has a ring of truth to it. But I really wouldn't say that right now. I think the difference is not that she didn't want a solution, but that she probably didn't want it right off the bat. So how would the conversation go if she told a woman friend about the problem? The response might be something like, gee, why do you think he said that? And then what did you say? And then what did he say? And then what do you think you might do? And what do you think will happen if you do that? So you ask questions, and then you come around to giving advice, because you need that information in order to know what advice to give. But there's something else about it too. In all the books that I write, I talk about the distinction between two levels of meaning in everything we say. The message level, that's the meaning of the words, and so if you know the language, you know what that is, but also the meta message. What does it say about the relationship that I say these words in this way at this time? How do I mean what I say, as Tanya put it, which we're all trying to answer in all our research? The meta message is what tells you what this person means when they say that. Just being willing to engage in an ongoing conversation, showing interest in all those details. How did he say it? Why do you think he said it? That shows a meta message of caring. And that very experience of having a conversation, a lengthy conversation about something that's bothering you, makes you feel less alone, and that here's somebody who cares about it. So I suspect when the guy offers the solution, the problem is less that he's giving a solution than that the solution cut short the conversation. And starting the conversation was probably what she was trying to do. Now, I can't help mentioning that cutting short the conversation may actually be a benefit to him if he doesn't understand why anyone would want to have that kind of conversation. It's always frustrating when somebody wants to have a kind of conversation that you don't get the point of. So I think that's going on too. I can't help making this little side point about this is a conversation I had with my own parents. So one time my mother told me she really was kind of upset. She had discovered my father was holding his arm in a funny way, and she asked, what's wrong? And he said, his arm hurt. And she said, how long has it been hurting you? And he said, a couple weeks. She's hurt. If you're close to somebody, they should tell you what's going on. And the fact that he didn't tell her, it was kind of like, what am I, chopped liver? So she was hurt. So I asked my father, this is research, asked my father, how come you didn't tell her? He said, I guess I was always trained to be protective of women. That made no sense to me. What does that have to do with being protective? He said, well, she's going to worry. And maybe it'll go away in a few days, so why should I worry her? But then he added something. He said, and furthermore, if I tell her I'm going to be coming up in the elevator, and some woman I've never seen in my life is going to say, Eli, how's your arm? Because troubles talk is the kind of conversation we like to have. So if my mother doesn't have her own troubles to talk about, she's going to talk about my father's. Or that is actually her problem, right? She's worried about her husband's arm, so it is her problem in a way to talk about. But this is a requirement for many women's friendships, that you really are expected to tell people what's going on in your life. And I think that's very closely related to something else that you see it among kids, among girls, and I think you see it also at all ages. And that is a value placed on sharing secrets. I actually collect pictures from all over the world, and I have pictures from all over the world. 2 little girls, and one is whispering in the other's ear. Now, I used to say I have never encountered a picture of 2 little boys, and one is whispering in the other's ear. Not long ago, 2 people in the audience sent me such pictures. So I can't say that anymore. I have seen 2. But it isn't as common, again. And that was a good reminder. All this stuff is not absolute. It's just tendencies. But this significance of telling secrets is very important. One woman, in telling me about, because I asked people, what do you think constitutes a close friendship for you? And a woman said, a close friend knows things about me that others don't. Another one said, if someone is a true friend, I tell her everything I think and everything I feel. One woman commented, she was telling me about various friends and telling me about the friendships, and she said about one friend, she's not that close a friend. I wouldn't tell her about my children's problems. So I understood that. At another point in the same conversation, she said about another friend, she's not that close a friend. I wouldn't tell her what I had for dinner. Now, at first, that puzzled me. Is that a secret? But then I realized it's like the extended conversation about something that happened in your life. The interest in the small details of your life is actually a sign of closeness. And think of that end-of-day conversation with somebody you're close to, and you say what you did and what you thought and who you met and what you said. And that is, by the way, something that, again, I wrote about You Just Didn't Understand, that rang bells for some people. That can be a source of frustration. For the way I put it, actually, in that book was that heterosexual women, if they have a close relationship with a man, they expect him to be a new and improved version of the best friend. And that's somebody to whom you can tell all these little details of your life. And so if she turns to him and says, how was your day? And he says, fine, nothing. She feels like something's missing. And it's quite similar in a way to what I encountered in writing about mothers and daughters. So one daughter said about her mother, who else can I tell I got a good deal on toilet paper? Somebody who cares about the details of your life shows you're not alone in the world. So again, that interest in details sends this meta message of caring. And when I was talked to women about friendships, and again, this was very similar for sisters. I wrote a book about sisters called You Were Always Mom's Favorite, and the book about mothers and daughters, which was called You're Wearing That. In all of these, there was a certain, people told me they were hurt, it was often that they weren't told something important going on in a friend's life that they weren't told, they'd be hurt. And sometimes it would also be not having been invited, not being included. So I want to say a little bit about that. So you've probably all encountered the acronym FOMO, F-O-M-O, fear of missing out. And it's often said that that's why we're checking our phones all the time, because you're going to miss something if you don't check it. Well, I came up with 2 new acronyms. I think it's another variation on that. One is FOBLO, F-O-B-L-O, fear of being left out. With FOMO, you missed the party because you didn't check your phone in time. With FOBLO, you missed the party because you weren't invited. And that's worse. So there's something actually very realistic and not surprising that girls and women have this FOBLO, this fear of being left out, because girls do punish girls they don't like by locking them out. And it's a little different from boys. It seems like if boys don't like a boy, they'll let him play, but they'll treat him badly. But girls, if they don't like a girl, they will just lock her out. And I heard a lot of very heartbreaking stories from people, mostly about middle school, some about high school, about friends just suddenly not wanting to be friends anymore. And girls are very creative about this. There's a colleague who has studied kids, Amy Sheldon. So she observed this interaction among little girls. They're playing house. A girl came over, wanted to join them, and they didn't want her to join. But you know, in preschool, many of them have a rule: you can't say you can't play. So what this little girl said to the one she didn't like was, "You can be the baby brother, but you aren't born yet." And Amy used that as the title of her paper. Very creative about giving her a non-speaking part. In addition to FOBLO, the second acronym that I devised is FOGCO, fear of getting kicked out. And that's worse. That's not just one friend decides to reject you, or they don't talk to you, but a whole group just kicking out a girl who was part of the group. And again, I heard many, many stories about that, again, mostly from middle school, but also from high school. And it's related to something that I also heard quite a bit about, and that is cutoffs. And I'm kind of curious, how many here have ever had an experience where someone was a good friend of yours and then she suddenly stopped talking to you, or you had a good friend that you decided you didn't want anything more to do with? It's very, very common. And interestingly, seems to be more common among women than men, which is, I think it has to do with the fact that our friendships can be so intense that you can feel it's overwhelming and don't want it at all. And I had that happen to me in high school. I have a lot to say about trios. I have, for some reason, many, many friendships among girls are threes. And that is an inherently complicated constellation, because there's always the fear of two seeming to align and leaving the third one out. So I was part of a trio in high school, the three of us. And high school especially, lunch can be very important. You go to the lunchroom, you got to have somebody to have lunch with. And I had these two friends, Susan and Marlene, and we had lunch together every day. We were friends outside of school as well. One day, Susan decided she wanted nothing more to do with me. Didn't tell me why. And Marlene tried to stay friends with both of us, but that meant she's friends with Susan, so she's with Susan, so I couldn't be there. And so that was it. And it was really traumatic, especially the lunchroom. I survived. I turned out okay. I made other friends. I'm all right. But I say it because it is such a common occurrence. And that there's a new word for it. People sometimes refer to it now as ghosting. And it's the not being told. And what fascinated me, when women told me about being cut off by somebody else, they almost always said they didn't know why. And when they told me they cut somebody else off, they always told me why. And I wondered why. Why do we not tell? And by the way, that's true of me too. Why do we not tell? And I think it's the assumption that if you tell, it's like you're inviting the person to explain it, and so you're going to keep the conversation going, and then you're going to keep the relationship going. So I think the not explaining is part of the cutoff, ending the conversation. And I talked to women who were telling me, several women who told me they still felt so guilty because when they were in middle school or high school, a girl was kicked out of their group and they didn't stand up for her. And one woman in particular, I guess she's in her 40s now, said how bad she still feels. She was in a group in high school, same group she'd been in middle school, but there was one girl from their group in middle school, and she'd been particularly close to that girl. And suddenly they turned against her when they were in high school, and she didn't stand up for her, and she really felt bad about that. And what she said was, she was really cute and really good at sports. And it's true, when we got into high school, she was making friends with senior girls, older girls. But she didn't deserve what we did to her. And I was quite struck by that. Why would being cute, being good in sports, and being friends with older girls, why would any of this be any reason to cut her off? And I think it's rather significant about girls' and women's friendships. And I think it has something to do with what I quoted earlier of a woman saying to me, I find friendships with women difficult terrain to navigate. It's the flip side of what is wonderful about conversations and friendships among women. A conversation where you say something and your friend says, oh, I know how you feel. I feel the same way. Oh, I know how you feel. The same thing happened to me. Oh, I know, I would have done the same thing. It's a very reassuring thing to be told, I'm the same. And I actually have a chapter in the book about sameness because it was such a theme, this sense of being the same as something that is valued. But being the same can be a requirement. And this is one of the things that the woman who commented she found friendships with women difficult terrain to navigate said. She said, if she expresses an opinion that's different or says, that isn't true for me, she said they take it as a put down. It's taken as a value judgment. So it's the flip side of the wonderful thing, that wonderful reassurance of being the same. If being the same becomes a requirement, it can be a negative thing. And when girls told me, and women told me, remembering when they were girls, of being turned on by their friends, it was often they were accused of being stuck up or snobby. Or again, as Candy Goodwin observed in her own research, she really thinks she's something. So it's this assumption that you shouldn't be better. And I can have a lot to say about that if I ever give another talk about women in public life, the double bind that women in positions of authority confront. I think it's behind a lot of the comments about Hillary Clinton. I just don't like her. That when women are expected to be self-effacing and just folks and like everybody else, and if they seem to be better and seem to be in a position of authority, then other girls can be very critical. And I was really quite struck, again, women telling me things that happened to them when they were younger, they might have been accused of being snobby and stuck up when the offense had nothing to do with it at all. But that's the kind of criticism that girls often come up with against other girls and women. So the flip side of that hurt is that source of hurt is the flip side of something that offers comfort. And I think that kind of is a thread running through a lot of the observations that I made about friendships and maybe about everything about human relationships, that often the thing that becomes difficult is the flip side of something really good. So for example, many women show me the requirement that you tell your friends everything going on in your life can be burdensome. You have to tell everybody, and you have to worry about who you're going to tell in what order. And this is kind of interesting. It was often said based on the book, You Just Don't Understand, sometimes even attributed to me, that women tend to be cooperative, boys tend to be competitive. In my later writing, I say I think we're all competitive, we're all cooperative, but we do it in different ways and sometimes about different things. One of the things that girls and women can be very competitive about is who knows what and who knows first. So if you are close to somebody, and closeness is the pot of gold at the end of the relationship rainbow, if you knew first, then you were closer, and that's a point of pride. And not being told can be really a source of complaint. So one woman told me a close friend of hers announced that she was getting divorced, and what the friend who told me about it said that this friend told her she had been having an affair for a while and was now getting a divorce. And the one who I spoke to said, she had lied to me, and now she wants me to be on board with it. She had lied to me. Not telling her that she had been going through this felt like a lie, because I was telling her what was going on in my life, and she wasn't telling me about that. One of the women that I interviewed commented about telling personal things in a way that I thought was very, very sweet, the way she put it. She said, when she tells somebody something personal about herself, she said, it's like saying, here's a little piece of me. This means I like you. And I thought that was very sweet. But I also liked it because it highlights the challenge. Now they have a piece of you, what are they going to do with it? And this is a challenge in friendships where you are sharing personal information. So the person you gave this little piece of you might, and again, it's about telling secrets, might inadvertently let it slip, might not have realized that it was meant to be secret, might decide to reveal it if they get mad at you, and might let it out that you told her, because that's evidence of what a good friend you are. And you want people to know that you knew sooner. A woman told me that her mother had warned her about this. Her mother said from the time she was young, her mother said, be very careful about revealing personal information to women who play bridge or get their hair cut every week. She said, quoted her mother, when they run out of things about themselves to talk about, they're going to move on to talking about you. And so this is another example of what I would describe, as I referred to earlier, that the risks are the other side of the gifts. The being able to talk about personal things is one of the wonderful gifts, and it's also one of the risks. I want to move on to something quite different that does tend to, again, make women's friendships maybe a little bit more complicated. And this is something that varies very much by culture as well as gender. But I'm going to contrast conversations among women with conversations among men that my students reported in field notes about solving challenges involving roommates. And I'm going to have to get a drink of water. Sorry about that. These are reading these field notes.
There was a request to speak louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you miss everything I said till now? Sorry? Oh, just the last comment. I said, sorry, I'm going to get a drink of water. It's okay if you missed that. Okay, so I'm going to read a description that a young woman wrote in my class, and then read a description a young man wrote in my class about how their roommates solved comparable problems. This is the young woman. On a couple of different occasions last week, I heard my roommates mention that they wanted to have a party on Thursday. I didn't think much of it until Thursday afternoon when I realized that I would be up all night writing a paper that was due Friday morning. I didn't want to be the annoying roommate that wouldn't allow a party, but at the same time, I didn't want distractions while I was trying to finish a paper under a deadline. So as I was walking back from class with one of my roommates, I asked, "So, what are you guys doing tonight?" She responded, "I'm not sure. We're thinking of having a party. What are you up to?" I told her I had a big paper due Friday. She responded, "Oh, in that case, we definitely won't have a party." I told her it would be fine with me. But she restated that they would not have a party, and that time I didn't resist. That's how she solved it. Now I'm going to read you how a young man described a similar situation. I couldn't help but overhear a brief exchange between my apartment mates this week. I was doing something or other in my room with the door open. One of my apartment mates was in his room with the door closed, cramming for his organic chemistry test the next day. My other two apartment mates were watching the World Series in the common room, passionately yelling at every play. This went on for a while until the one studying opened the door and yelled, "Guys, can you keep it down? I'm studying here." The response was, "No." The one studying followed with a quick, "Go to hell." The conversation concluded with a remark from the common room, which I cannot read in public, but it starts with the letter F, and they actually said it, F you. And with that, the problem was solved. They lowered the volume on the television and mellowed out considerably. No one was mad, just a typical way of problem solving in Henley 60, and that's the name of the door. So quite a contrast. I sometimes read this when I talk to my class about indirectness, because it has often been said, again, often attributed to me, that women are more likely to be indirect than men. And again, I have written since, I don't think that's true across the board. It does tend to be true. There are many cultural differences. In fact, I talked this afternoon about the very first paper I ever wrote in linguistics, and it was about conversations I had had with the man I was then married to from Greece, where he was indirect and I was direct. And I think that's partly because of my background, which is Eastern European Jewish, and I grew up in Brooklyn. Anybody else from that background? But there does seem to be a general tendency among Americans that women are more likely to be indirect when it comes to getting their way. I think men tend to be more indirect about other things, for example, apologizing. That's another whole story. But you know what? The guys were indirect too. They were indirect. They were saying the opposite of what they meant. They said no, they said go to hell, but they were going to accommodate. So it's just different ways of being indirect. But that style that was common, that I just read you among the women, is the girls, they call themselves girls, was very typical of much of what I heard from young women in my classes, especially about making decisions. And I encountered a very parallel situation in a work situation, parallel conversation, a work situation. I appeared at a conference. I was going to be a speaker. The woman running the conference mentioned to me, that it was a plenary speaker, that one of the other plenaries, someone we both knew, was not going to be there. And she said, "Judy called me this morning, and she said," this is the one organizer quoting Judy, "Judy called me this morning, she said, 'Oh, I'm coming down with something, I feel horrible, I think I've got a fever, but if you really need me, I'll come and give my paper.'" And the organizer reported to me, and I told her, I really need you to stay home and take care of yourself. And I said, that is wonderful. Can I quote that in my talk? And she said, yeah, sure, absolutely. It was great direct communication. She thought it was direct because it was clear. There was no question that when Judy said, if you need me, I'll come and give the talk, she knew that her friend wasn't going to say, I don't care if you're sick, you get out of bed and you come here and you give that talk. There was no way she was going to say that. So, yeah, it was indirect, but it was clear. And I think this is really key. Indirectness is not perceived as indirectness by the people who use it. You have said what you meant. However, I happen, and Robin Lakoff has written about this at great length. Why would anyone communicate that way? There's a clear payoff, two payoffs. One, you didn't make the demand, as the young woman said. I didn't want to be the annoying roommate that wouldn't allow a party. And you feel that someone is accommodating because they want to. And the person who does the accommodation doesn't feel they were forced to. They feel they did it out of their own choice. I did have the opportunity to observe a situation in which it didn't work. I was in the office of a colleague of mine, another woman. Phone rang. She picked up the phone, and I heard her side of the conversation. It was something like this. Oh, gee, I don't see how I could possibly do it. This is one of the worst terms I've ever experienced. I'm teaching an overload course. 4 of my dissertation students are defending this term. I'm on the rank and tenure committee. I knew it would be a lot of work, but it's even worse than I expected. But if you can't find anybody else, of course I'll do it. And when she hung up the phone, she looked at me with a true sense of shock on her face, and she said, I told him I couldn't do it, and he put me on the committee anyway. I believe she felt she had said no, but she said it in a way that depended on him to acknowledge that she was saying no. So either he realized he didn't have to listen, or he really missed it, and it could be either one. And this is a conversational style difference that came up in many conversations reported to me by women and those I've observed between women friends. We have different conversational styles because of the ethnic background, regional background, part of the country we come from. And friends can have different conversational styles and can lead to problems like that. Here's an example, very much like the one I just gave you, reported to me by the woman to whom this happened. She actually cut the friendship off because of this. So they had gone to college together. Friend from college is in town visiting one of them, the one who talked to me. And he said, I hear so-and-so lives in town too. Are you in touch with her? And she said, yes, I am. He said, I'd love to see her. Fine, I'll find out if she's free. Calls up the friend, so-and-so is here. He'd like to see you. Are you free? Do you want to see? Yes, absolutely. Come over. They come over, seems to be fine. The next day, she gets a call from that friend. The friend is livid. Why did you bring him over? I hate him. I can't stand him. I didn't want to see him. But you said I should. You should have known from the way I said it that I didn't mean it. Now, depending on your style, one or the other may seem at fault. If you tend to be direct, that's ridiculous. You should have known by the way I said it, I didn't mean it. On the other hand, maybe you wouldn't say, don't bring him over. You would expect the person to understand from the way you said it. I don't know if any of you noticed this. About a month ago, I had an op-ed in the New York Times. And it was about a friend who had come over for dinner, and I didn't want her to help, and she kept helping, and I kept saying, I don't help, sit down, and she kept getting up and helping. And I kept saying, I don't want you to help, and then she was up again, and at one point she made it into the kitchen, and I actually grabbed her arm and yanked her out and plopped her down, and I hoped I was good-natured and humorous about it, but it was really bugging me. I was really bugged. Now, normally I would have just, she's a friend, I like her, I wouldn't have made a big deal of it. I probably wouldn't have invited her to dinner again. But I was writing this book, so I wanted her perspective, right? It was research now. So I had a conversation with her, and I told her how I had reacted and asked her why she kept helping when I told her I didn't want her to. This look of shock went across her face, just like my friend who hung up the phone and said, I told him, no, she said, I was just at my parents' house for dinner last night, and I helped my mother serve, and she said, no, don't do anything, sit down. And then I helped her clean up, and she said, sit down, I don't want you to help. And then I washed the dishes, and she was saying, stop it. And then I cleaned the kitchen, and she said, thank you. And she said, you never listen to me, and I'm so glad you don't. And she said, in my family, it wasn't actually just her mother and father, in my family, I don't want you to help means you're a guest and you shouldn't help, so I appreciate it all the more when you do. So it never crossed her mind that I meant it. Now, can you imagine how embarrassed I was? I have written books about this. That some people are indirect and don't mean what they said literally, and yet, well, I explained I'm New York Jewish, East European Jewish from New York. It never occurred to me that she thought I didn't mean it. And this is actually quite interesting because my parents are born in Europe. Her parents are born in Europe. She's Jewish. We're Jewish. But she's German Jewish. And it's a different style. And they are more like, her family, I don't think they're unusual, is more likely to be indirect in that way. Here's another example of a conversational style difference. Was reported to me by a woman about a very close friend. They're walking around the lake. They're having a great talk. One is telling the other about a problem. They've been friends a long time. And the one who's listening, as they're walking, if she sees something really pretty or really interesting, like, oh, look at those ducks, you know, with the little baby ducks coming behind, or, oh, look at that gorgeous flower, she'll just throw that in. And at one point, her friend who was telling her about the problem stopped and said, you haven't listened to a word I've said. And the one who told me it was so hurt. And this is the thing that all of this, you know, it's funny and it's common and it happens all the time, but it's so deeply hurtful when someone you're close to, who you really trust to know how you mean what you say, misunderstands. Meanwhile, you're misunderstanding them too, but that, you know, you're not realizing it. She was so hurt that her friend could have thought she wasn't listening. Of course she was listening, but it's a different way of being considerate. She didn't want her friend to miss that pretty sight. And they also were, one friend New York Jewish, and one, they were both from New York, but one East European Jewish, one German Jewish. So I found that interesting as reinforcing those different styles. And I will give you one last example of a conversational style difference. And again, this happened to me. Talking to a friend, and she's from South Carolina. Anybody here from South Carolina? Who has lived in South Carolina? And I asked her what she thought of a certain mutual acquaintance that neither of us knew particularly well. And she said, I don't really know him. And I said, I think he's a jerk. And she said, that's what I just said. And I said, what? She said, well, in South Carolina, you cannot say somebody is a jerk. So you have to proceed on the assumption, if I knew him long enough, I'd find something to like. So I don't really know him means I haven't found anything to like. I found this interesting but unconvincing. It didn't quite make sense to me. But I was in luck. Not that long later, I was at some sort of reception. I met someone for the first time, and he said he was from South Carolina. So I asked him, supposing you asked someone what they thought of someone, and that person said, I don't really know him, what would that mean? And he said, that means he's a no good, no count. So it was confirmed. Now, again, this is somebody I'm friendly with, not a close friend I'm friendly with. I quake in my boots to think what she thinks of me when I say somebody's a jerk, that you really can't say in her culture. And one last example, this is a very short one, don't worry, it's not a long story. Woman whose mother was in the hospital told her friend her mother's in the hospital, and then the friend never asked, how's your mother doing? And that hurt her because she assumed if you care, you're going to ask. So she confronted her friend. And the friend, who was Vietnamese American, I think that could have not been coincidental, said, "Oh my goodness, my family always taught me you don't ask personal questions like that. If somebody wants to talk about it, they will volunteer." And these kinds of differences just cut to the core of what you think the relationship is about, how we judge whether somebody cares or not, that meta message of caring, and they can all be different. So let me wind up. What I try to do in this book then is just to understand all the ways that friendships, particularly women's friendships, can be so deeply gratifying, but also how they can be challenging. And I did talk more today about the challenging part because the misunderstandings, in a way, I guess, are the most revealing, letting you know what is going on that you might not notice if something didn't go wrong. But I also have lots about what's wonderful about the friendships. You don't have to worry if you give it to a friend, she's going to think you're accusing her of doing something terrible. And I do focus in particular on the role of talk, of course, since that's my field. But I think it can help to know that kinds of frustrations that you might experience with a friend may be similar to those that others experience, that it may just be traced to different assumptions, different conversational styles, habits, and it may have nothing at all to do with anything either of you did. And I'm going to conclude by telling you that I did find out that was what happened with my friend Susan, who stopped talking to me in high school. And I'll tell you how I found out. Very shortly after we graduated from high school, I wanted to contact her and ask her why she stopped talking to me. And I looked for her in the alumni magazine. She was not in the alumni records. I knew which college she had gone to, but she was not in this is, after we had graduated from college, she was not in the alumni records of her college. And then the internet came along, and I started Googling her. But as happens so often with women, she had got married young and changed her name, so she wasn't findable. From the moment that I made up my mind to write this book, I also made up my mind I am going to find her and get the answer, because now it's research I needed for the book. Well, I had actually a complete draft of the book. And again, I'd been Googling like crazy, and I'm not especially talented with that, but no sign of her. But I have a friend who's really gifted at finding information online about relatives that came from somewhere else. So if you want to know what boat your grandfather came on, he can find it. So I was talking to him about it, and I remembered my friend Susan her family was from Iraq. I thought she was born in this country, but I knew her parents were born in Iraq, and she had several much older siblings who had been born in Iraq. So I thought maybe he can find something, and I gave him the name. So this was Friday night. Sunday morning, I get an email from him. He found the immigration records. She was actually born in Iraq, too. Her name was Suad. Changed to Susan. She was 7 when she came. But luckily, she had an older brother who he was able to find, and he found the email address of the older brother. So I immediately began composing an email to write to the brother. I wrote to the brother and said, "Are you the brother of this Susan that I knew in high school?" And he very quickly answered and said yes, and he CC'd her, different last name. So I began composing the email to write to her, and I was really working hard on it because I thought maybe she still doesn't want to talk to me. But as I was laboriously trying to craft the right email, an email came from her. And 2 hours later, we're talking on the phone after 54 years since she last spoke to me. And the first thing she said was, "It was my brother who made me stop talking to you." Not that brother, different brother. If it was the other brother, maybe he wouldn't have put us in touch. And what she said was, her brother felt that I had too much influence over her. And they were a very conservative family. In fact, they she was supposed to either be at school or at home, and she was telling her family she was in the library, and I was taking her to Greenwich Village. And so the brother threatened that if she didn't stop talking to me, he would tell the parents, and obviously there would be terrible repercussions. But what she said is he told her that I had too much influence over her. And then she said, but I think he was just jealous. And that just fascinated me because, and you can see this in the book, I had already written a paragraph in which I had said, sometimes when you live with parents or caretakers who are older, they make the younger person cut off friends. And it may be for good reason, and sometimes it might be, even though they may not realize it, that they're just jealous. So I was very, very pleased that that was evidence that what I had written had some truth to it. And now we're friends again, and that has a happy ending. But I end with that because, one thing, it's dramatic, but also the cutoff in itself, I think, was a testament to how deep and how powerful friendships can be. So I'll stop there. Thank you.